All right. We good? Cool. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation here at Carnegie Mellon. Thank you so much for waking up a little earlier than maybe you would have liked during fall break to make it here today for this distinguished lecture. I think you're going to be very happy that you did. I'm glad to see you all grab some treats. Just to introduce myself, I'm Daniel Tachik. I'm the executive director here at the Scott Institute. And we host these lectures as a way of kind of informing, educating, and inspiring the Carnegie Mellon community from distinguished folks such as Gordon today. Before we get to the introduction of Gordon, in case you're unfamiliar with the Scott Institute itself, we are Carnegie Mellon's hub for all things energy. We have over 170 different faculty affiliates spread across campus, all the disciplines, all of the schools on campus. And it's our job to kind of bring all these disciplines together to work together in new ways. So we give out seed funding for new clean energy research each year. We provide support for new energy research initiatives. Again, this is more than just supporting individual faculty members across campus, but really bringing different disciplines across campus together. It's not an easy feat to do that, and that's why we have organizations like the Scott Institute to bring everyone together. We also provide a lot of support for our energy and clean tech startups. And we also host many energy-themed events, such as this morning's distinguished lecture. If you aren't already subscribed, if you came in past the registration table, we had a QR code. Feel free to pull out your phone and scan this. We email you just once a month. And this is the best way to get information about what's happening on campus related to energy and clean tech. We know email is crazy, and we're very cognizant of that. And so we only email you once a month. So don't worry about receiving too many. Other ways to stay in touch. This is our email address. We're on LinkedIn, we're on X, we're also on the web. So with that, I'm honored to invite Ramtin Siashansi up to the stage to introduce today's speaker. Ramtin is the director of the Carnegie Mellon Electricity Industry Center, SEEC. And he has a personal relationship with Gordon, so we're very delighted to have him introduce Gordon. After the lecture, just a quick logistical note, after the lecture, both Ramtin and Gordon will be engaging in a fireside chat before we open it up to questions from the audience. So please join me in giving Ramtin a round of applause.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. It's a distinct honor to introduce our lecturer today, Gordon Van Welie, who is president and CEO of ISO New England. I'm actually not going to go through and read the formal biography that he gave us. That was in the email announcement, so you're welcome to look at that. I will note amongst his many honors, he is a member of National Academy of Engineering, which is a testament to the contributions that he's made to electricity systems, operation, planning, market design, so on and so forth. What I wanted to say to introduce Gordon is just reflect a little personally on my working relationship with him. I've known Gordon for over a decade now. We first met when we were both serving on a Department of Energy advisory committee. And actually went back to my email archives. I dug up from the second set of emails that this is before we had ever met in person. So the second set of emails that we had ever exchanged, we were working, so we were on this advisory committee subcommittee on energy storage technologies. And we were tasked with preparing a white paper for DOE leadership about integrating energy storage into wholesale electricity markets. And this is from the second email exchange with someone I've never met, saying the message opened, this is much improved, referring to the white paper that we were working on, but I still think we may have a significant disagreement on the market design objective. Now, I'm not quoting this to burnish my reputation as a disagreeable person. I'm quoting this to make the point that what I've gained most from Gordon is our discussions, debates, occasional disagreements about market design issues, because in addition to being deeply knowledgeable about the topic area, Gordon has a really keen insight into what the limits of the mathematical and the economic theory are, and what the real world implementation challenges and implications are. And so having seen a preview version of the presentation is going to give, we're going to see that again today. What does the theory tell us, but then what is the next step, the last mile challenge to actually get these things to work in practice? And so I'm super excited to hear what he has to say about this, and thank you again for visiting us, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I'm honored to be here. That was impressive that you could find an email from 12 years ago. So yeah, I've spent 25 years trying to implement the theory. And some things have worked well and some things haven't worked so well. And that's going to be one of the topics I'll get to later on. So I have two parts to my presentation. The first part is really a quick update on where New England is as a region in terms of the energy transition and some modeling we've done. And then the second part is really a transition into some of the big questions and big assumptions that were made at the start of this journey 30 years ago in terms of the implementation of wholesale markets and which things have been working well and which things have not been working so well. So the first thing I'll really focus on here is where we're at in the region in terms of the energy transition. And I'll just preface this by saying, probably about 10 years ago, we started investing heavily in our modeling capabilities as it became clear that we needed to become more sophisticated as an ISO in terms of being able to model the energy transition, what the implications were from a resource adequacy point of view and from a cost point of view. And so we steadily built that capability over the last decade, and I would say particularly in the last 5 or 6 years have been producing some really excellent information that's been able to inform policymakers in New England of the implications of the transition. So here's a slide that I like a lot because it just shows you the impacts of the transition over the last 25 years. So the dark blue bars are the energy, is where the energy production came from an electrical system point of view back in 2000. The light blue bars are the energy production for last year, for 2024, and the green bars are a model effectively of where the region needs to get to by 2040 if it's going to stay on track with its decarbonization goals. So what's quite dramatic, if you look back, the dark blue bars, in 2000, 32% of our energy was coming from coal and oil. By probably 2020, that had gone to almost zero. 2024, you can see that it's essentially minimal. We just, the last coal unit closed in New England earlier this year. And we shifted to producing most of the electricity from gas. Let's see, there we go. So this big blue bar in the middle. And if you look today, most of the electricity is coming from gas and from other relatively clean resources, so hydro, renewables, imports, which are mostly hydro imports from Canada, and nuclear. So as a consequence, dramatic reductions in emissions in the region over that period of time. Looking forward, what the states want to do is shift away from the dependency on natural gas to move towards renewables to power the economy as a whole and decarbonize the economy as a whole. So in the studies that we've done, there are some big implications for that, this next stage of the evolution. And the first big implication, I'll get to, there's a slide later on, we're going to shift to a winter peaking system in approximately 9 to 10 years. Basically due to electrification of heating and then electrification of transportation. But what comes with that is a dramatic variability in terms of the winter loads because it's all weather dependent. If you have a mild winter, you're going to have lower demand. If you have a severe winter, you're going to have much higher demand. And that has big implications with regard to the resource mix needed to operate a system and keep it stable. Emissions reductions will also be seasonal, so we're going to decarbonize the spring and the fall very quickly. The winter is going to be the hardest because that's where we're going to need fuels effectively to keep the system going. If the states decide to try and do this only with wind, solar, and batteries, it's going to be very expensive because ultimately we'd have to build out the system to 4 times what it is today. And that has some implications for this next point here, which is firm, dispatchable, zero carbon generation could help this tremendously if such a thing were to exist. It's the mythical DEFR that New York ISO came up with, the dispatchable emission-free resource. Maybe SMRs are going to do it, maybe long-duration batteries are going to do it, but this technology effectively doesn't exist just now. So in the absence of this technology, it will be gas. This sort of puts into context what the region would need to build out if it were to rely just on wind, solar, and batteries. 1.3 gigawatts of offshore wind per year, 268 megawatts of land-based wind, 955 megawatts of solar, and 952 megawatts per year of batteries. The only one of these that is actually on track is the solar. So New England has invested remarkably, given how much sunshine is in New England throughout the year, in about 1 gigawatt of solar panels per year over the last decade. I often refer to the New England system as a 42 gigawatt system, of which 10 gigawatts is now behind the meter. So we're sort of running this hybrid system right now where the production is 3/4 from the grid side and 1/4 from the distribution side. One of the other things we did upon request from our stakeholders and the states was to do economic studies to understand the economics of the transition. And we periodically update this. I'm going to be giving you some key findings from the most recent economic study that we just published. This just gives you a very high-level overview of the key findings. The first one, I made the point a moment ago, including more dispatchable technologies reduces the needed capacity by over 15%. So you can make big reductions by having some dispatchable resource to balance the renewables. Shifting the hours of the peak demand in the winter can reduce costs. Easy to say, hard to do when you are essentially depending on the electric system for heating. These are some slides that will come later on. Emissions reductions beyond 85% of policy goals drive escalating costs, very steep cost increases. I'll come back to that. Demand growth obviously also increases cost beyond the 2040s. Deep decarbonization in the 2040s really drives fairly massive curtailment of renewables and reduces the economic viability of certain technologies. Solar PV is one of them. I mean, every solar panel you add as you go along is going to have a lower and lower marginal contribution to the system. Short duration batteries, essentially in the wintertime, are not of much use because they get discharged very quickly or can't charge because they don't have the arbitrage capability in the winter. And then the other thing that was interesting is land-based wind is consistently economical from the mid-30s out to 2050. So really you can get a long way towards decarbonizing the system with solar PV, and then the wind helps you sort of carry it the rest of the way. So this slide shows you there's 2 sort of bits of information here. The one is carbon emissions, and the other is the cost of mitigating carbon. So focusing on carbon emissions, we can get to 85% of 1990 levels by about 2045. The system already is at about 35% of 1990 levels. And you can see this goes up to begin with because effectively what happens is as you start increasing demand on the system, before you've put all the renewables on, you can burn more gas, and in the wintertime more gas and oil. So there's this upward trajectory on carbon emissions for a while before you get enough renewables on the system to start displacing the fossil fuels and then start dropping your carbon emissions. What's interesting here, and this is relative to where we are today, is the cost of mitigating carbon. So it's not that there's a zero cost today of mitigating carbon. There's already the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and which prices carbon at a very modest level. And there's effectively a shadow price on carbon through all the PPAs and incentive arrangements that have been created by the states to drive the renewables on the side of the market. But just look at what happens here as you get into this last phase of decarbonization, massive cost increase. And so it does make me wonder whether that's going to be politically acceptable in the end to go all the way to the end in terms of decarbonization. Because, just to reflect on what's happening today, probably the biggest conversation in any region around the country is around affordability of electricity. We were just having discussion about this over dinner. I believe your retail rate here is around 17 cents per kilowatt hour. In Boston, it's 36 cents per kilowatt hour. California, it's 40 cents per kilowatt hour. So I think what we're seeing are limits right now on what consumers are prepared to pay for electricity. And so that does make me worry about that curve, particularly in the back end of that curve. So this transition into where we are from a resource perspective and demand forecasts. So this pie chart over here just shows you in June of 2017 what was in our queue. About 50% of what was in our queue was natural gas. So people were still thinking that they would build natural gas in New England, and the rest of the queue was renewables. Fast forward to 2025, and you can see it's all wind, solar, and batteries. So basically the market is saying we're not going to build new gas. There's no policy support for building new gas resources yet in New England. That may shift because of what's happened with the offshore wind industry. You can see here in the offshore wind industry, what's that? That's 15 gigawatts of offshore wind was planned. We will be doing well to get the 2 wind farms that are under construction up and running, one of which was put on pause for a while, but is now back in under construction. So when I look at what's happened to the offshore wind industry, I think it's been set back at least a decade because the developers have lost billions of dollars, and they will ultimately not do anything until they start seeing policy support for offshore wind at a federal level. At this point is my view. They're all focusing back on Europe in terms of the investment opportunity over there. So that's a big hole in terms of what the region was planning. Onshore wind is now come into focus, and I'll talk a bit about transmission to enable that later on in the presentation. So this is an interesting slide in terms of the net energy use in the region. You can see we peaked at 136 gigawatt hours back in 2005. The all-time system peak from a demand point of view was in 2008. And look at what's happened to net energy use over a period of 20 years or so. And that's because of, in the first instance, massive investments in energy efficiency, some of which was paid for through our capacity market structure, and the various incentives that the states put in place. And then I would say over the last decade, massive investments in solar PV. So effectively what it did is it moved the demand, it either took the demand away through energy efficiency measures, or it moved it off the grid to behind the meter in terms of self-supply at some level at a residential or commercial level. But of course, as one starts ramping up electrification of heating and transportation, that demand is going to come back. So that's why you see this come back. And you can see by 2034, we're projecting around 130 gigawatt hours again. And there's a slide coming, I think, here, yes, next couple of slides. It just shows you how that manifests in terms of the summer and the winter peaks. So you can see there's a modest growth in the summer peak of about 4%. It might be on the low side because what we're seeing is with the deployment of heat pumps, as people put in heat pumps to deal with winter heating, they're also using them as whole house air conditioners in the summertime. So we've gotten, in the last year or two, we've noticed that the summer lows are a bit higher than what we expected. So, I wonder whether that 4% might be a little higher, a bit low on the low side. The winter peak, you can see a big jump of 25%. And so electrification is sort of driving an additional 13%. This is in the 10-year forecast. So what we're looking at here is through to 2034. One of the points I make on the slide, though, is that these increases in these peaks have a very distinct implication with regard to how the load side hedges itself against both energy and capacity market risk. So one of the things I'll come back to, one of the themes is that there has not been really robust hedging by load with regard to these risks. And we see that not only in New England, but we also see it in PJM and other regions. And that has triggered a lot of discontent, let me put it mildly, around capacity prices recently. The other headline here is that, while New England is in a decent spot right now from a resource adequacy point of view, it's not that far away from reaching equilibrium. And one of the things that could end up creating a problem for the region is were we to have unintended retirements or premature retirements. Our modeling suggests that about, before I get to the future here, more than 7,000 megawatts of generation have retired since 2013. One of the things that we did was a big investment in transmission. I'll come back to that. That allowed us to turn over the grid. So the markets were very efficient in terms of pushing older, less efficient resources out and replacing them with more new, efficient resources. But of course, if we're going to drive demand up through electrification policy, you need to have supply. And so one of the variables here that we're going to have to keep a close eye on is how quickly these retirements continue to take place. And we're projecting that another 4 to 5 gigawatts of generation are at risk of retirement. This is a chart that shows you what's happening in terms of the convergence of the summer and the winter peaks. So you can see here, this is the winter and this is the summer. The line in the center is the average. And then, the dotted line in the top would be the 90-10, the peak effectively. And you can see those coming together in the middle of the next decade. So one of the big points on this slide, though, is this point over here, and I'll come back to this later on, energy adequacy. So it's no longer sufficient, I think, to just look at resource adequacy, which is some way of looking at the nameplate and relating it to the nameplate of the generation resources you have and relating that to the classic 0.1 loss of load expectation or 1 day in 10 standard. That standard just looks at frequency. It does not look at the depth and duration of shortfalls. And so there's a big gap here around the reliability standards in terms of making sure that a system can be reliable. And the practical point here is you need to have enough energy stored in your system somewhere to ride through those periods when ultimately the renewables can't produce. And so for now, that is going to tend to be fossil fuels. But that means you've got to have the supply chain that can supply those fuels. And in New England, we have these fairly severe pipeline constraints that in the wintertime restrict how much gas there is available to gas-only generators in the region. And we end up switching to burning oil or very expensive LNG. And those are really stored fuels. And you can go through those stored fuels very quickly during a week or two long cold snap. So, in terms of trying to educate policymakers in the region, I came up with a very simplistic framework of the 4 pillars that are needed in order to navigate a successful clean energy transition. And pillar 1 is clean energy resources, pillar 2 are balancing resources, pillar 3 is energy adequacy, and pillar 4 is robust transmission. Most of the time, you'll see people focusing on the clean energy pillar and the robust transmission pillar. That's where all the news is. But what people forget about or discount is what's needed here in order to make the system operate. The balancing resources and, as I mentioned a little while ago, energy adequacy. And so this has implications for market design. I mean, transmission stands on its own. It's typically a monopoly service in the sense that incumbents have most of the transmission. There are some merchants on the fringes. Most of the transmission is socialized via some form. But the markets really are trying to ensure that these first 3 pillars come about to some extent. The wholesale markets do not price carbon at the moment, so they cannot fully drive the clean energy transition. It gets driven through, or cannot drive the clean energy resource investment directly. Most of that is coming through government incentives in some form, either historically at the federal level or at the state level. But the issue of whether or not your system is reliable ultimately and whether you have sufficient energy adequacy is a function of really how you account for the contribution of those first two pillars under periods of system stress, either during the summertime or the winter, or in those periods when in the fall and the spring you have a lot of plant out for maintenance. And I'll come back to that later on. So at this point, I'm going to transition into sort of talking about the assumptions and expectations underpinning the move to competitive markets. So I've given you a framework of where we are today. And I would say, at the start of this part of the presentation, what we are discovering are the boundaries and the limits of applying the theory of wholesale markets into the real world. And there were certain assumptions that were made 25 years, 30 years ago that were simplifying assumptions. And it turns out some of those simplifying assumptions are big constraints. And so how you go about navigating around those constraints is important from a market design point of view. And ultimately, what it does is it pushes you into workarounds that are not effectively compatible with the original goals of the wholesale market construct. So just to give you a framing here, what I'm going to show you in a minute is a dashboard, sort of a traffic light setup where I've got some things laid out in green in terms of these things are working well. And then I've got some things that are laid out in orange where we have mixed results. I would say they could go either way. They could go towards green or they could go towards red. And the red would be the category where we've either had poor results or results that are concerning with regard to the efficacy of the wholesale market construct looking forward. And then I end with some assumptions, some of these assumptions which, looking back now over 25 years, I'll say, well, we made that assumption. Was it really a good assumption? And if it's no longer a good assumption, what do you do about that? And unfortunately, in that section, there are just a whole bunch of questions without any good answers. But that is, to sort of prompt you to think about, the risks and the difficult questions coming. So here's where I think things have really worked well. So if I look at, the introduction of wholesale competition, one of the big premises here, and we were talking about this over dinner last night, was could you move away from a monopoly cost of service structure, set up a structure where you can incentivize people to invest, have confidence in the market, and drive investment through a market structure, and in doing so, ensure that end users are shielded from poor investment decisions. Because what had happened in the decades prior to that was central planning, integrated resource planning, had led to decisions in certain resource types that were not necessarily the most efficient in the long run. The big example was the big cost overruns in the nuclear build-out in the 70s and the 80s. I would say you can check the box and say wholesale competition has really driven massive investment. Actually, I make this point in the supply side response and innovation. So we've seen massive investment in generation and demand side resources that have led to efficiencies. The advent of LMPs allowed us to price transmission constraints and steer resources to be locating at the right spots in the transmission system. And there's a very close linkage between the economic dispatch of the system and the LMPs. So I think all of that has been to the good. And really you've seen that model now spread out right across the US and many other parts of the world as well. I think it's widely recognized as the best practice, and I don't think we'll ever abandon that. Transmission planning, you might be surprised to see that in green, because that's a big debate and it depends on where you are. So I've got it in green here for New England. You would change that color depending on where you are elsewhere in the country. The reason I have it in green is that New England got an early start on making investments in transmission, some $14 billion of transmission to address reliability issues that became evident very quickly once we deployed LMP-based economic dispatch in the 2003 timeframe. Ironically, going into the wholesale market construct in the late 90s, one of the big assumptions that was made for political reasons was that New England was a copper plate, that there was no transmission congestion, which was, just kind of a ridiculous assumption, to be honest with you, because everybody really knew that that was not true, but the people didn't want to have price separation amongst the states. That phenomenon is still present in many parts of the world, including Europe. So Germany, for example, still holds firmly onto the idea that they shouldn't show price separation for political reasons, and therefore they can't get past the point of just a uniform clearing price for everyone, which creates all kinds of other inefficiencies. So coming back to transmission planning, we probably have the least congested transmission system in the nation. And it also allowed so congestion costs are low, and it also allowed for the turnover of the fleet. And it has allowed for the integration of the first big wave of renewables. And so I look at that now as being, yes, it was expensive, but it probably came at a third of the cost of what it would cost to do it today. So it was a wise move by the region to do that early on. One of the recent innovations that has occurred is that we've worked with our states to come up with a long-term transmission planning process where we look at what investments are needed in order to enable public policy, in particular the renewables and decarbonization agenda. And we have set ourselves up as the consultant to the states, where we will do the studies, we will run the RFPs, but ultimately they make the decision about whether to move forward with the investment or not. And so that we gave them control effectively, and that's worked out very well because they feel like they can trust us, that we're not going to just go off and spend a bunch of money without it being justified. And also it helps us because ultimately we're not in conflict with the states. We sort of removed a friction point between ourselves and the states because they feel like they have ownership of the investments that are being made. And so there's a fairly elaborate cost-benefit exercise that will occur with each one of these transmission projects. And we presently have an RFP underway for building out the transmission system up to Maine in order to enable several thousand megawatts of land-based wind up there. And so we've received the bids for that RFP, and we will be hopefully awarding those in 2026 sometime. So that I feel very positive about. And then the last point I'd make here is that one of the other things that's come into focus in recent years is the transmission owners investing heavily in the asset condition projects. So those costs have started to rise. And so upon request of the states and the transmission owners, we've been asked to take on what's called an asset condition reviewer role. We've been very clear that we don't want to take on a regulatory role here. We do not want to do prudency review, but what we can do is facilitate the process to make sure that there's transparency around transmission investments. And we're the first ISO to embark on that journey. So here's where we have mixed results. Retail competition got off to a promising start in New England, but it's largely receded. Really, the people that are engaging in competitive procurement are the large industrial and commercial customers. Most residential customers are still on what's called standard offer. One of the downsides of that is they have no pricing incentives to flex their demand. So that's a big problem with regard to the overall efficiency of how we operate the grid. And it is a problem with regard to the decarbonization trajectory because to keep costs under control, we really do need to have demand be quite flexible. And unlike Pennsylvania, New England doesn't have a big industrial base. It's basically residential plus small industry. A big load in New England is a hospital or a university. We don't have the sort of heavy industrial base that you have here in Pennsylvania. So just sort of made the second point already, which is demand response. Penetration of active demand response is very limited, in part because there are performance expectations if one offers into the capacity market. And so that has caused demand response providers to be cautious about how much they offer. And also, as I mentioned, the states really haven't embraced dynamic retail pricing, so there's very little price responsive demand at the retail level. Resource adequacy, from a New England perspective, I would say it's yellow. In other parts of the country, you could maybe classify it as red. This is still a big challenge. I would say the biggest unsolved challenge, fully solved challenge in wholesale markets is how to deal with resource adequacy and energy adequacy. So whereas the day-to-day optimization of the system is really a solved problem, the issue of making sure that there's enough resource on the system throughout the year and over time is the big challenge. And what we have learned, we implemented a forward capacity market almost 20 years ago. We ran 18 auctions. We were changing the design every year. It's a very hard thing to administer, a wholesale capacity market. It's quite administrative. People fight over it. It's ironic in a way because only 10 to 20% of the revenue comes through the capacity market. 80% of it comes through the energy market. But there are armies of people that will fight over the allocation of this 10 to 20%. And so it's become a very sort of emotional issue. And you see that playing out here in your region as well. One of the things we decided to do was to move to a prompt seasonal market, away from a forward market. And there are lots of benefits there in terms of simplification of the market design. And one of the things we also want to do is move to a seasonal summer and a winter market with modeling the gas constraints in the winter time and making sure we implement a methodology called marginal ELCC, which is where you're looking at the marginal energy contribution of resources either on the summer peak or the winter peak, and then accrediting the resources according to their ability to perform under those conditions. That is going to cause revenue shifts amongst the resource base, and we expect that to become quite a heated discussion during the course of 2026 as we start moving this new design through the stakeholder process down to the FERC. And the last point I'd make down here is I've been speaking out about this during the course of this year, both at Congress as well as at the FERC Tech Conference on resource adequacy. I've come to strongly believe that for resource adequacy to be successful, there needs to be a joint and complementary role between the ISO and the states. For any resource adequacy mechanism to be successful, it needs to have the support of the states. And if it doesn't have the support of the states, it's dead in the water. And so if you look around the world and you look around the nation at the moment, the areas where resource adequacy is being best addressed is where there is strong policy support at both the state and the federal level. When there's a disconnect at either the state or the federal, or in worst case both, you end up having a real mess on your hands. And so I think this is one of the learnings for me over the last 25 years. So here's where we have some poor or concerning results. I've mentioned energy adequacy, so I won't dwell on that. I'll just say here in terms of financial hedging, one of the original concepts, if you sort of go back to the Bill Hogan view of electricity markets 25, 30 years ago, the idea was that the ISOs would run spot markets and that willing buyers and sellers would bilaterally contract with each other and would hedge their positions. So that hasn't happened the way it was originally conceived. And I would say there's too much of a dependency by load on what the ISOs are doing through the capacity markets or the equivalent structures. And I think for these things to be successful in the long run, we need to have load back in the business of hedging itself and contracting bilaterally and really having the spot market be effectively the penalty price if you haven't hedged yourself, either from an energy or a capacity perspective. And then the last thing I won't dwell on, just because I'm keeping an eye on the clock here, is one of the things that we've spent a lot of time focused on in New England is the interdependencies between the gas and the electric system. This is one of the simplifying assumptions that were made. Nobody thought about the fuel constraints. And yet we're in a place here where the electric system depends on the gas system and the gas system depends on the electric system. They're regulated in two separate silos. There's no coordinated planning. And I think it's really a disaster waiting to happen. So we've seen it happen already in Texas. We had a close call with Winter Storm Elliott. As the system demand increases, the lack of any sort of coordinated planning between these two systems, I think, is really a problem. I fear that we're not going to do much about it until we have a big problem on our hands. But like the 2003 event that sort of changed the world from a reliability standards point of view. So here are some of the big assumptions that were made. That the first would be that supply side frictions would be manageable. I mean, the whole idea of a market is you put the price out there and people will respond to the price, but that it's relatively frictionless, that people can enter the market. I mean, if you have a market and you can't get new resources to come through because there's a lot of barrier to entry, that market is not going to function very well. And we've seen a lot of that. It's very hard to get certain resource types built. In certain parts of the country, it's hard to get any resource type built, right? And I'd put New England into that category as well. It's a very difficult thing. So supply side frictions are a big problem. I've spent some time talking about this second one, which is, the assumption was that customers or their proxies would enter into long-term supply contracts to both either produce more supply or to reduce their demand, to avoid or manage shortages, that you would have a way to solve the free rider problem that exists. And I would say that really is an assumption that has not worked out well. We're still struggling with that. It's really embedded in the big debate around resource adequacy constructs. And then the last point here is that, I think there was an implicit assumption that federal and state policies would be aligned around wholesale markets and competition, and that federal and state policies would be aligned around the externalities. And we've discovered, of course, that that's not true. So it makes it very hard for markets to work efficiently when you have this lack of alignment or these frictions that are occurring in the system. So looking forward, I think given the supply-demand conditions, we're going to see energy, ancillary services, and capacity markets the pricing be volatile. That's going to trigger political reactions. We know that we need long-duration balancing energy sources. We don't have an effective technology there yet that's decarbonized. In the interim, gas will play that role. I've mentioned the coordination of resource and energy adequacy has become more tenuous. I've mentioned that this issue of the interdependent nature of the gas and the electric system is a problem that hasn't been solved. And then I raised this question was who should make the policy decision on how much reliability is desirable? It comes back to the issue of the reliability standards. Are they sufficient? And who gets to decide what they look like? Because ultimately consumers have to pay. And you can test this and you're going to get a different answer from different people depending on their situation. And so is this a state decision or is this a federal decision? And how can it be a state decision if they're part of an interconnected network that everyone's depending on and there's a free rider problem? So I think this is a huge issue that we're grappling with and hasn't been solved for. I won't spend a lot of time on this. The headline here is we're trying to balance multiple objectives, reliability, obviously, but also affordable decarbonization of the regional energy system. And so the costs and the reliability trade-off there is very much at the forefront of the debate. I've mentioned that we're moving to redesign our capacity market, so I won't spend any more time there. And I'll just end with saying, what I started with a little earlier on is that, insufficient entry of new resources or unexpected load growth or unexpected resource retirements, all of these things could threaten resource adequacy in New England. So we're like a gigawatt long at the moment that can evaporate pretty quickly through retirements and or load growth. And so the last point here, given the high barriers to entry right now, we are worried about the timeliness of new resource entry. So particularly given the big hole that's been knocked in the resource plan for New England with regard to the offshore wind, the big question on our minds is, will the states keep their foot on the on the accelerator with regard to electrification? And if so, where is the supply going to come from? Or are they going to back off on electrification in order to sort of take pressure off the supply side of the market? So I think there are some big decisions coming for the region in the next several years. We're okay for now, but I think by the time we get into the start of the next decade, I think that issue is going to come sharply into focus. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Great. Why don't we?
Yeah, thank you, Gordon, for that wonderful talk. And we'll have a 5-10 minute fireside chat between Ramteen and Gordon, then we'll open it up to the audience after that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for, as I expected, very interesting comments and discussion.
Ramteen, sorry.
Oh. Yeah, so thank you very much for the very interesting remarks. So I wanted to start with one of the basic premises of what you predict is going to be the evolution of the system, which is this move towards much greater use of renewable energy in the ISO New England mix. So if I remember correctly, you had a slide that showed, for example, your current interconnection queue shows a significant amount of offshore wind. And we've seen, past few months, offshore wind projects essentially being stopped dead in their tracks by federal policy. So kind of bigger picture, how does this temper your thought about how the energy mix is going to change if, every 2 to 4 years after a federal election, state and federal policy is going to potentially shift in significant ways, and we're seeing the federal government now, I think, putting more of its thumb on the scale in terms of capacity investment.
Right.
How are investors and developers thinking about that as well?
Well, I think. Oh, actually, I still have the lapel mic here. So can you all hear me? Yeah. So I think there's sort of two conversations that are going to happen in parallel, and it's very hard to predict exactly where this is going to go. On the one hand, I think the states are very frustrated with regard to what's happened with regard to the offshore wind. And we've just released a study in this most recent study. It also shows we can go quite a long way towards decarbonization by using solar and land-based wind. With the solar becoming effectively more expensive as we go forward, not only because a lot of the federal subsidies have gone away through the elimination of the Inflation Reduction Act, but also because the marginal contribution is going to become more expensive going forward. Land-based wind is going to require big investment in transmission. So the step that I talked about, which is relieving the transmission constraints into Maine, I think the earliest that will allow for additional land-based wind is probably by the mid-2030s. So that's not a very satisfying answer to the question of where the resources are going to come from. Batteries are being deployed, but mostly short-duration batteries, which are very good in the summertime, but not great in the wintertime. So there's two other conversations that have started up in New England. The one is around, should the region relieve the gas pipeline constraints? So this was squarely on the table a decade ago. I mean, it's ironic that we're 300 miles away from the cheapest source of gas in the world, and we're importing gas from thousands of miles away and paying European prices for natural gas. There's sort of a lack of logic around that, but if you, from an economic point of view, but if you look at it through the lens of trying to constrain the dependency on natural gas, I think that's where policymakers, came at it to say we don't want to continue to perpetuate our dependency on natural gas. But that said, given the limited options, the question of affordability, that question is back on the table again. Should New England do something about that? It will depend on Massachusetts, quite frankly. So I think at this point you have the governors of Rhode Island and Connecticut signaling they're willing to consider that. But when we looked at this a decade ago, the economics only work out if Massachusetts is a party to that conversation. And so I'm not sure whether that's going to go, to be honest with you. And then the last thing that has surfaced in the last 18 months or so is a interesting conversation around small modular reactors. And we were just chatting about this last night. You know, I think it'll depend on the economics of SMRs. And so if wind has been set back by some period of time, when the option resurfaces for wind, offshore wind to come back onto the scene, what will the cost of that option be relative to SMRs? If SMRs are cost competitive with offshore wind, then I think we could see a switch towards SMRs. And there's lots of sites in New England where we have decommissioned older nuclear stations where you could deploy SMRs. So I think that's a question mark in the long run.
Yeah, so kind of building off that, you mentioned a couple of things that could be interesting questions to probe. So one is, you mentioned the gas supply issues in New England and in the presentation as well. Is your view that the FERC needs to move towards having something akin to NERC, like a gas reliability organization for the gas system? Do you think we need to completely revamp gas electricity industry regulation and kind of bring them under a single umbrella?
Yes. So, I mean, I've been saying that for a while. Jim Robb has been saying that. The previous chair of the FERC, Willie Phillips, said that. But I don't think it's going to happen without Congress getting involved. So, I mean, I think you've got the Federal Power Act and you've got the Natural Gas Act, and from that springs the regulation of these two industries. Those were set up at a time when there was very little interdependency between these industries, and nobody was thinking about the fact that they have become interdependent. And so here we are, highly interdependent systems and sort of siloed regulation and siloed planning. So I think it's a problem in the long run. I'm not sure what will cause it to change, though.
Sure. So in your presentation, you mentioned, one of the negative, or one of the, I think it was the red stoplight, were supply side frictions. And do you view that being mainly impediments to building transmission? Is it challenges with actually undertaking interconnection studies? Is it something else? What are the major barriers that are keeping supply side resources from entering the system?
Actually, the last bullet on this slide, so it's all of the above. And so there's community resistance pretty much to everything, whether it's solar or wind or transmission lines or LNG or, batteries. I mean, basically everything is going to hit some level of community resistance. And so that's an issue. So it's siting and permitting is an issue. The interconnection queues have been an issue, less so in New England, but clearly have been an issue in other regions where the amount of interconnection requests are overwhelming the planner's ability to study it. In New England, that's more of a phenomenon at the distribution system, given all the resource that's trying to come onto the distribution system. And then I think the other point on the slide is the supply chains. We don't make any high voltage power transmission equipment in this country. It moved offshore, right? And so it's 7 years for an EHV power transformer. And so if you want to scale the grid and you have to wait 7 years to get a critical component, same is true with HVDC components. So there's a massive supply chain problem both on the T side of the equation as well as on the generation side. It's now a 5-year wait for combined cycle. So it's not physically possible because the vendors are not in a position to provide the equipment fast enough, and they've been burned so many times before, right? So, I mean, because, if you're in the business of making this equipment and you go all in and then find out that the demand evaporates 3 years later, then you're stuck with that investment. And so I think that's a problem we haven't solved for.
So thank you for this wonderful brief chat. We really want to hear from you all now. So if any of you have a question, we'd love for you to start with your name and either the department or the organization that you represent. I saw Granger first, so I got to hit to him.
Hi, I'm Granger Morgan from Engineering and Public Policy and also Electrical and Computer Engineering. Talk a bit about the situation on the demand side. I mean, for example, are any other states in New England emulating or thinking about emulating efficiency Vermont? Also, the place that I grew up in, once under Green Mountain Power or Granite State Electric, had time of day rates, and my father went ahead and put in storage heaters, and now those rates are gone. I mean, we get them for transmission, but we don't get them for. So talk generally a little bit about the state of things on the demand side in New England.
Yeah, so through a variety of different studies we've done, both in terms of analyzing how one can avoid some of the transmission cost and the resource costs that I described, I mean, we've made it very clear to the states there are great cost advantages to enabling demand response. And time of use is not a great tool anymore because it's too static, so you need something that's more dynamic than that, some form of dynamic pricing at the retail level. The states have struggled with that because I think they've struggled a little bit with, are people going to be annoyed with that? Additional complexity and the price volatility that they'd be exposed to. There's also an initial upfront cost in terms of deploying the automation to actually make it work. So I think most people are not going to have the wherewithal to sort of sit there thinking about whether they need to turn on their dishwasher at a certain time. I think automation should be able to solve that problem, but it requires that somebody, help support the investment in that automation. So the states have formed a working group. There's a New England Conference of Public Utility Commissioners. They have a working group underway where they're talking about how do they activate this through reform of retail rate design effectively. And we're hopeful that they will move forward in that space. I think it's absolutely essential because without this, I think we're going to overpay or we'll end up overinvesting in the infrastructure that's needed. And I think this is an untapped opportunity at this point in time.
Anybody emulating efficiency Vermont?
Yes, actually, on a small scale. I mean, what we've advocated for, though, is standardization amongst the states and to have this be operationally coordinated with the ISO as well. So I think that's part of it. Rather than sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom here, it's a relatively small region. If the states could get together and set up the system so that it's a predictable response and it's a standardized system across New England, that would be ideal. Whether or not they can get there or not is a question.
Thank you so much for a very insightful talk. I'm Anna Siefkin. I'm formerly with CMU Energy Institute, former DOE, and I now work with the Long Duration Energy Storage Council. So you mentioned a couple of times batteries. You also mentioned the need for longer storage. So what are the barriers that currently exist for you from a policy or even technology readiness level that would allow more longer duration, 8 hours plus, on the grid?
Yeah, I don't think there's any real policy impediment in the sense that the wholesale market, is open to long duration storage. It's, I think, really a technology issue. So the one technology that is being deployed in New England is the iron oxide battery long duration, but it's a very slow charge and very slow discharge. So that's not particularly useful. And it's hard for that resource then to make it in the wholesale market given the dynamics. It really needs a counterparty. And so, it will have a counterparty if a state's prepared to sign a contract with it, going back to the bilateral contracting that I mentioned. But the issue is that from a technological point of view, really what we need is long duration storage that is able to be dispatched quickly up and down. I should have added that into it. That's the technology we're looking for. And and it doesn't exist just yet. I mean, I can think of ways to get there. You could power a fuel cell with hydrogen, for example, but that's a very expensive proposition. So the issue is, is there a cost-effective, long-duration battery that is flexible? And the answer is not yet.
All right, given the constraint of time today, we have time for 2 more questions. I want to make sure we hear from a student. So,
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Keith Oxley. I'm with Civil and Environmental Engineering. I have a question to follow up something that Ramtin mentioned. So you said there's a 15 gigawatt hole from the offshore wind issue, but land-based wind is a much smaller scale. Solar is a much smaller scale. SMRs are a much smaller scale. So how is that gap going to realistically be filled with those technologies?
That's a great question. We don't have an answer to that. So, so just to remind you, the ISO, it does not plan the resource mix. I mean, the whole premise of this is we set up the market, it produces a price signal, and investors respond, and all the states might cause a response through creating incentives or long-term contracting on the side, sort of the bilateral contracting regime. So there isn't a good answer to the question, and we're worried about the supply-demand balance. And that's why I mentioned earlier on, there are things that could push us into a resource inadequacy position. What are those things that could occur? The one is demand growing faster than supply can be added. The other is premature retirements. And so those, how this shapes up in the 2030s is going to be critical. And the states are the ones really who do control a lot of the levers. So they're the ones that are to a large degree controlling how quickly demand grows through the incentives that they're creating. They're also the ones that have been really at the forefront of stimulating the new supply side through all the incentives that they've created. So it's a really hard policy question right now.
Hi, my name is Tomas. I am an energy science, technology, and policy student here at Carnegie Mellon. And actually, for the last 4 years, I've been living in Vermont. I went to Bennington College for my undergrad, and I actually worked with Efficiency Vermont for my senior's thesis in analyzing the pitfalls of rural communities that they might have in the decarbonization process, just because there is a lot of lack of efficiency in either the grid or the infrastructure or their homes, which tend to waste a lot of fuel in order to just kind of meet the expected demand that a much more efficiently operated household would have. So I was wondering, kind of twofold, does the ISO have any sort of, hand in looking at these rural communities, which kind of use the majority of the energy, even though they are more separated, just because they do not have the same amount of efficiency that other homes would have? Or is there any planning that is made into your long-term planning process to either include these fuel sources, or are there ways that you guys plan on increasing the efficiency in connection with the rural communities in New England?
It's a great question, and the short answer is no. So, the ISO, just to remind you what the ISO is and what it isn't, we are an independent wholesale market operator and bulk power system operator and administrator. We don't own any assets. We don't plan the power system other than the transmission. And so the question you're asking is a good one, and the states are grappling with it, but it's very much a state level issue. And New England has some of the oldest housing stock in the nation. One of the most expensive things to do is to make a house more energy efficient. So there are things you can do on the margin in terms of making sure your windows are tight, but if you don't have insulation in the walls and you put a heat pump in, you're going to be unhappy, right? Because it's not going to heat you in the middle of the winter. You're going to need a backup heat source. And so the issue of how do you get the housing stock and the building stock to be more energy efficient and really tight so that you don't waste the energy, that's an unsolved policy question. And the problem with it is, how do you fund it? So I think the region is grappling with that. Most people I know who put the heat pumps in because they're putting in incentives, are keeping in their backup heat source. Because the heat pumps, depending on how tight your house is, if you've got a really tight house, the heat pumps will work okay. If your house is old and leaky, it's not going to work okay. You're going to need a backup heat source.
Okay, we have time for one super quick question. She's promising me.
Hi, my name is Hannah Morin. I am a PhD student. I study lithium-ion battery degradation. I'm curious, when you think about long-duration battery storage, what the economics are as far as dollar per megawatt hour, since you could build a really, really big battery that you discharge, very slowly, but it would be very, very expensive.
Yeah, I mean, so you're right. You're probably closer to the economics on lithium-ion than I am. I mean, I own some Tesla Powerwalls. So I have experience with what they do in my own home. And I think trying to use lithium ion for long duration is everything I know is it's not economic at the moment. So that's the problem. I mean, I think the problem is there is really no storage technology other than fossil fuels at the moment that give you the characteristics that you need to operate the grid. I think where lithium ion and other short duration storage technologies, their sweet spot right now is sort of the day-to-day balancing. 2 to 4 hours get you through a peak on a hot summer day. That's the sweet spot. And so dealing with the winter, though, is the real issue.
Do you have an idea of what would be cost competitive from like $1 per megawatt or $1?
What I'm hoping is SMRs will become cost effective. Because if you can have a dispatchable resource like that you don't have to worry about the charging and the discharging, that would be perfect. That's the yes, probably.
Well, thank you for all the wonderful questions. Ramtin, thank you for facilitating a wonderful chat. And Gordon, thank you so much. We're honored to have you here. Thank you for visiting Carnegie Mellon. And you're welcome back anytime.
Thank you. Thanks so much.